And so now we're going to move into our next session. And it's on climate change and agriculture, which is a very topical issue that's on everybody's minds these days. Just going to pop up the program here before I introduce our guests. There we go. So our moderator, Farah Atiyat, who's from Jordan and a member of this year's masterclass. And we have three presenters, Sita Tudujian, Jez Fredenberg, and Dr. Maj Al-Naber. And you can see their details of their profiles, so we won't go through all of those. But I'll now hand it over to Farah, and she'll do some quick introductions, and we'll spend the next hour talking about climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. I'm very happy actually to be here with you all. Today we are going to talk about climate change and agriculture. And as you know that now there's an powerful evidence about the impact of climate change in in all the regions. Actually, it's not only in the MENA region as well. We see lots of countries suffered from this impact during the last days. Actually, we saw the flooded in Germany and in other countries, and we saw as well the wildfires in some countries like Turkey, for example, and Greece, and even Lebanon as well. So these are the real evidence that it's come actually, and it's meant the impact, what is it's needed from the country. Come with their new NDCC plans, and they have to reduce actually what we call the greenhouses emission, and so we can keep the temperature of the actually the whole world due to 1.5 degrees. And so we keep this range of the temperature for the Earth in this actually range, and it's not going to raise up to the 2.3 or 4 degrees. So the impact is going to be disasters. So today we're going to have our speaker with us to talk about the climate change and its impact. So we're going to start actually. She's the director of a program in the International Center of Bioline Agriculture, and she is an advocate and a change champion of sustainable development and sustainable food system. So we're gonna now invite our presenter to present her actually present her to the audience. So Sita, the floor is yours. Sita, she's with us, right? She's supposed. Sita, are you there?
Her colleague Shokat is there. Is that the connection?
Sita will join us. So we're gonna go to the next presenter, Jez Fredenberg. She's a freelancer journalist in the UK, and she's most involved and investigative reporter about agriculture and climate change, and she did a very actually a lot of reports around this topic. So maybe just you can please start your presentation, and also the floor is yours. Are you there, Jess?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Hi.
Yeah, please.
Hello.
You can
Thank
start
you.
actually.
Great, sure. Hi everyone. Thanks for having me on. I don't have any visuals or anything like that, I'm afraid, because I'm a bit of a last minute slot into this. So I'll have to try and just entertain you with what I talk about. But yes, basically I was awarded an IFAJ prize last year to go and look at wildfires in Portugal, but also elsewhere. Obviously, COVID meant that I didn't get that far. Luckily, I was in Portugal when that all happened. So mainly I looked in Portugal. But my idea was to head there in 2020 to look at how the farmers had been impacted by wildfires and how things were changing 3 years on from some really, really severe wildfires in 2017 in Portugal that had essentially, they were the most devastating wildfires the country had ever seen. In July and then in October, 120 people had died and hundreds of thousands of hectares of farmland and countryside were burnt. And so I kind of went with quite a simple idea of finding out what had happened 3 years on, but it quickly became clear that this was a really complex topic, and just so many different factors were involved when you start talking about wildfires. So I think it's important to say that climate change is like one really important factor that we need to understand here, but there are also lots of other ones which are all related to like land use and farming and economics and politics and all sorts of things. So I guess bringing us back to today, I mean, just looking at the news online at the moment, obviously a lot of places are really suffering from wildfires. We've got Canada, the US, Siberia, Greece, France, Portugal, Algeria, Bolivia. You know, it really is global right now. And I think it's important to note some of these fires may be fairly normal in the sense that certain areas such as Southern Europe have always experienced wildfires, and they're actually quite an important part of an ecosystem's natural regeneration in some cases. But what we do know is that the nature of wildfires is changing. So they're becoming more intense, more frequent, and they're moving more quickly and covering larger areas. And crucially, their behavior is becoming less predictable, because traditionally, you know, firefighters have been trained to deal with wildfires. But what's happening now is that when those firefighters are getting to them, they don't actually know what's about to happen. And that's when they become like really, really deadly. And you know, they're starting to then cross into the human world more, I think. And we're obviously seeing that in Greece at the moment, and I think in Canada some really devastating kind of consequences. So I think there is some other significant changes to note with wildfires at the moment. The first is that these big wildfires are starting to impact areas geographically far from them. So just because you're far from a wildfire, perhaps across an ocean, doesn't mean that you won't be affected anymore. Right now, for example, smoke from wildfires in North America has reached Spain and Portugal and brought high levels of carbon monoxide. So this is also becoming like a health crisis, not just where wildfires are happening, but much more globally. The other point that is changing is that extreme wildfires are now impacting the weather, not just the climate, but the weather. And I'm guessing everyone understands the difference between weather and climate here. We'll come on to climate change more in a second, but this is something that I looked at for the BBC, and basically the fact that extreme wildfires are now starting to create their own weather systems around them. The most extreme of which is something called a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which is essentially where the fire gets more and more extreme and a lot of smoke gets funneled up into the atmosphere in a huge column, and it reaches a very, very high level of the atmosphere, like several kilometers up, and it builds and builds and builds, and then it essentially collapses. And this is what happened in Portugal in 2017 and one reason why so many people were killed is that it's essentially like a bomb going off. You imagine it's like a huge mushroom cloud really high up in the atmosphere, and then suddenly the energy kind of switches the other way and it whooshes back down through this column and explodes outwards at extreme speed. So that's something to bear in mind, how it's changing, and this is something that a whole bunch of scientists around the world are really looking at now and trying to understand how that's changing. As far as farming and food production goes, the damage is definitely being felt. Like right now, for example, over 100 vineyards are being affected in Provence in France. In Greece and Portugal, we know olive groves have been destroyed previously. I'll carry on. Ecologically as well, some ecosystems are maybe now getting to the point where they can't bounce back from this. So because either the fires have become more extreme than what they are naturally like adapted to, or because the fires are happening more frequently, so these ecosystems are getting like pummeled one after the other, so they don't have time to recover. Or what's also happening is that some of these ecosystems are just not adapted at all to wildfires, which brings me on to the next point, which is that the other change that we're seeing is that wildfires, these extreme wildfires, are moving further north. For example, like, you know, Siberia at the moment, but they're also happening in Europe. They're moving further north into often places that are very highly wooded, which is also a bit of a worry, such as Sweden, which have very little natural defense because, again, the landscape, the ecosystems are not adapted to this. The people as well are not used to it. The firefighters are not used to it. So we're kind of, the danger is, you know, spreading all the time. So I think obviously this is very much a man-made disaster, like very definitely in many ways. And like I said earlier, climate change is one of those factors, but the other factors are that essentially humans have changed the landscape, the ecology of places, and like I said, the climate. And so we've actually removed a lot of the natural defenses against wildfires, such as more like diversity in our forests. And at the same time, we've kind of turbocharged it all with climate change. Now, obviously, farming is linked to all of these things in like very big ways. But it's also like very complicated, and things they're not always clear cut, and they're different in different places. So for example, in some places actually a lack of farming and an abandonment of the landscape and a lack of use of controlled fires now is actually increasing the likelihood of wildfires because that vegetation is no longer being cleared away. So there's a whole myriad of different things going on here. And just to explain it a little bit more, I want to just quickly zoom in on Portugal because it will give a few more examples. Some of these will apply to other places, but others, sometimes it will be unique to Portugal. So, for example, some of the things I found out in Portugal that had led to these extreme wildfires was it kind of almost started with a law change that was passed several decades ago, which meant that when a farmer died, they had to, the people that inherited the land, it had to be divided up between multiple people, which meant that all the farmers ended up with all these tiny, tiny little parcels, often only 1 hectare in size. Obviously, this made it very, just completely economically unviable often to actually farm that as a business. So what then happened in Portugal was that a lot of villages and rural areas started to be abandoned. And there are now entire villages in the country that don't have anybody living in them at all. So what we then had was a lot of that farmland around the villages was not farmed anymore, and it started to become overgrown. No one was clearing it manually or with fires. So we're sort of gradually building up all this biomass ready to be, that can go up in flames really easily. This change in the ownership also made it very difficult to then manage the landscape and create things in the landscape that could halt a fire. Because in one small village, and I spoke to a mayor in a village, it's almost impossible to organize something because so much of the landscape is owned by just hundreds of different people, and you might not even know who they are because often that land has been completely abandoned because it's sort of a bit worthless. So there are all these absent landowners. At the same time, the paper industry, which is very important, has planted a lot of eucalyptus trees, which are non-native, and they literally have evolved to burn and spread their seeds via burning. So a lot of landowners have, as a quick buck really, as a way to use this tiny parcel of land, have also planted eucalyptus trees, which obviously have just, when the fires have happened, it just goes, boom, just goes straight through them. Politically as well, the money has been spent more on firefighting than prevention. So anyway, so that's just one example in one place of what can happen. Hugh, am I right for time? I have no idea how long you want me to speak. I'm about to get on to climate change specifically. Shall I carry on?
Yeah, go ahead, but you have 3 minutes actually.
Okay, great, cool. Okay, so obviously it's a very complex picture there, all related to land management. Now onto climate change and how it all sort of fits into that. So I spoke to a few different scientists around the world about this, and it was actually quite hard to pin down an answer about whether, really how climate change fitted all into wildfires and whether climate change was actually causing more wildfires. But I spoke to a Canadian climatologist called Mike Flanagan at the University of Alberta, and he had been saying that climate change is causing more extreme wildfires for 20 years now, because of a myriad of different reasons. Basically, what has been happening is that we have warmer winters. So what happened, with lots of rain, so there's warm, wet winters in a lot of places are causing vegetation to grow much more quickly. But then we have longer and drier summers and springs, which dries out everything. So we end up with this massive vegetation that is all dry, that is then more easy to burn. So that's one reason. So basically, yes, it's like drying out fuels and extending the fire season. So he does think climate change is impacting it like that. What is less known though about wildfires is how they might be contributing to climate change. So he said, there's a lot of checks and balances in our climate system, and some of those things might bring warming and some might actually bring cooling. So he says that, for example, obviously burning fuels is releasing a huge amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is definitely not going to help climate change. But there are other mechanisms that then become less clear. So for example, when you've got big wildfires, a lot of the carbon that gets released, essentially the soot, the black soot in the atmosphere, it can actually create warming in the atmosphere by either blocking the sunlight or falling on snow and ice and absorbing solar radiation. On the other hand, smoke can block solar radiation and can cover a large portion of the globe and actually cause regional cooling, which is something that happened in Australia last year, when a large cloud from the wildfires actually cooled for about a month, it cooled a part of the landscape there. So anyway, there's a whole range of different factors all sort of coming into play. So it's not an easy thing. And just very quickly to sum up the solutions to this, that I mean, when I talk to people, the solutions that they suggested were political, physical, and social and economic solutions. So political is redirecting the majority of funding from fighting fires to preventing fires through long-term policies. Physical solutions include clearing vegetation using fire, creating a landscape patchwork that breaks up forests, placing a kind of net of measures across a land that can respond to fire behavior and stop a fire in its track, having more ecologically diverse forests, bringing back extensive livestock grazing and crop production. So that's a whole sort of, land managers' area of interest there. And then social and economic solutions is things like developing the bioeconomy of forests so that they're better valued and protected, capitalizing on the green economy, for example, for natural plastics, cosmetics, things like that, and agritourism. So yeah, so basically there's a whole range of different things that need to be looked at, but the overall message is that it's not simple, and how climate change fits into this is not simple either.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jess, for this important information. And I agree with you that dealing with the climate change and its impact, and especially in wildfire, it's not that easy, but at least we can use the new technology to predict about the wildfire and to draw the map where it can happen and when. And so they can deal also with the farmers with the new technology. They can actually give them like a training how to use the new technology, and maybe we can help them, because some of the farmers, they cannot find the fund to have these kind of new technologies. So we can actually also help them, the government help them in this way. So thank you very much again, Jess. And now we will move to our next presenter, Sita Tonjian, and she's gonna speak actually about more concentrating on the climate change emergency and what it's needed on the topic of the food security, because we know that also one of the climate change impacts, it's threaten actually the food security in all the regions, and what it's need to be done in this sector, and how we can actually also produce the food, and how can we actually deal with all the process of the products until we ensure that the people will have all the resources for food actually available. So Sita, the floor is yours. Sita?
Yes, thank you, Majd. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. Apologies for being late. Just give me a second. I do have a presentation just to put it on.
Go ahead, please.
I need to share my screen. Okay. And share. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Is it in screen mode? Because
no, actually, no. You need actually to press on the previous. Yeah, please. Now okay. It's okay.
Perfect. And let me open the. Okay. So a quick. Is it moving?
Yeah, it's moving. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a quick introduction about myself. I'm Sita Tonjian. I've been working on advancing sustainable development in arid regions, specifically over the last 25 years. I started my career in Jordan with changing social norms and behaviors revolving around water demand management, as Jordan is a heavily a water scarce country. And then I moved to work on this topic in the region. And in 2014, I joined the International Center for Biosaline Agriculture, which is headquartered in the UAE. And we focus on marginal environments. And when we talk about marginal environments are those that are constrained by biophysical constraint. So we talk about degraded lands, we talk about scarce freshwater resources, difficult terrains, and these are coupled with unfavorable climatic conditions from heat, drought, dust, which further accelerates the biophysical constraints. And a large proportion of those environments, because of lack of economic opportunity, we notice that there are also socioeconomic constraints and limitations. And these constrain development even further. And globally, we have around 1/3 of the global population lives in such environments, and including the 1 billion poor and most of the malnourished people. Or undernourished people, because malnourishment also includes overeating and obesity. So we're talking about malnourishment particularly. And with climate change, these biophysical constraints are expected to increase in scope. And these constraints will be faced by more and more farmers in the coming decades. And so if we look at the planetary boundaries that the Stockholm Resilience Centers issued, first of all, we noticed that humans and our activities are causing such large impacts on the life support system and processes that regulate the whole Earth system, that we are currently the largest driver of change on the planet. And 4 of the 9 boundaries are compromised. 2 of them are heavily compromised, which are the biosphere integrity, which basically refers to loss of biodiversity and extinction, which just referred to. And the second one is the biogeochemical flows, which primarily refers to pollution. And these are really, if we look at on the lower right side of the screen, we know that these zones are really beyond in a very high risk factor. And then we have the 2 other planetary boundaries that are in increasing risk are the land change system and the climate change. So demand for food and for water and natural resources, and the large percentage of that demand for water and natural resources is driven by food, and food demand is the main cause that is affecting all ecosystems. So if we look at the lower left side, the land resources, we will notice that 77% of terrestrial land is already modified by human activities. And if we look at water resources, and these are really, it's not so evident to us because water resources are either underground or in oceans that we don't visit a lot, but 87% of water resources are modified by human activities. And many of the ecosystems, whether they're land, terrestrial ecosystems, or aquatic ecosystems, are on the verge of collapse. And this, of course, has serious consequences, which also just covered on from one aspect, which is fires, but they have consequences for human well-being, for development, because biodiversity and the other ecosystems, they provide vital services. For instance, they maintain healthy soil, they pollinate plants, they purify water, they purify air, they protect against extreme weather events, and this is only to name a few. So as we are compromising those ecosystems, particularly on biosphere integrity, we are really heading towards a growing crisis that would affect not only food production, but also our way of life. So the next one is we're looking at land system change. So 40% of global land is currently used for food, fiber, and feed production. And 1/4 of terrestrial land is actually degraded today due to human activities. And this is causing many, like beyond fires, there are many other consequences. For instance, this is accelerating soil erosion. So currently, soil erosion is 100 times more than soil formation. And this leaves farmers struggling with falling yields, or they try to compensate for these falling yields by buying chemicals to replace essential nutrients. So this, first of all, raises their cost if we're looking at the human dimension, but then it also leads to runoffs that further exacerbates the geochemical flows that, or the pollution to our resources. And because the other aspect is because of the current industrial system of agricultural production, we have widespread agricultural pesticide use. So 64% currently of global agricultural land is considered at risk of pesticide pollution, with 31% at high risk of pesticide pollution. And while if we look at mitigation efforts, we will notice that most of pesticide contamination efforts are currently focused on water and air, overlooking soil contamination, which is further exacerbating this planetary boundary. If we look at water, 70% of freshwater resources currently are used by the agricultural sector. And at the planetary scale, the additional amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus that are activated by humans, and these basically affect the next boundary, which is the biogeochemical flow boundary. These elements are extremely overloaded currently. And we have 1/3 of all the rivers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia are contaminated. The ocean's chemistry is changing with dramatic and serious increases, whether it's deoxygenation due to the phosphorus and nitrogen overload, or due to acidification because of CO2 increases in the atmosphere, which the ocean absorbs increasingly higher amounts of. And this leads to acidity increase. This is on top of that, we would notice that the excess pesticide, the excess fertilizers, they go into rivers, and these also end up in the ocean. So we have been seeing an accelerated number of dead zones rising up throughout the coastal areas and in the ocean. So climate change, which is today's topic, according to the IPCC report, which was issued last week, global surface temperatures between 2011 and 2020 was 1.09 degrees higher than between 1850 and 1900s. So we have already hit we're above the 1 degree mark. And we notice larger increases over land than over ocean, which further reinforces the point that Jess mentioned. And the latest report, assessment report 6, was very clear in its message that climate change is due to anthropogenic or to human activities, and that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented over the last 2,000 years. According to the same report, over the last 70 years, which is since 1950, hot extreme weather events have become more frequent, and they've become more intense across most land regions, with cold extremes becoming less frequent and less severe. So if we take the agricultural sector or the food system, let's talk about the food system, because really we cannot talk about agriculture without looking at the full food system, which includes agricultural production, but it also includes the transportation, the processing of food, the consumption of food, and even the disposal of waste that remains, because they are driven by each other. So the food system in its entirety is responsible between 21 to 37% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So basically, the food system is both a driver and also part of the solution. It has to be part of the solution for the climate crisis. So I think the main message is that we are in a planetary emergency, and there are several interconnected and reinforcing environmental crises. We cannot really look at the climate crisis without considering the biodiversity and the pollution crisis. And these unfolding environmental crises are impacting, and at the same time, they are being impacted by rising social and economic crises, from inequalities to poverty, to food insecurity, to health risks. Even we see a rise in conflict that is related to natural resources depletion. And all these different threats are affecting and are being affected by others. So as for our food system, it is part of the biosphere, and the resilience of agricultural production and of our food is dependent on remaining within planetary boundaries. And when we talk about the full planetary boundaries, because the health of our planet Earth is dependent on these 9 planetary boundaries. And climate change and biosphere integrity, which is biodiversity, are the 2 most critical for the resilience of the food system. But also, if we look at water resources, land change, and the others, they are also important. And if we hone in on climate change in particular, the Global Commission on Adaptation's report that was issued in 2019 says that only if we take climate change by itself, it can drive an additional 100 million people into poverty just in the next 10 years, which is during this decade that we are in. So a safe future for humanity requires radical transformation. And here, when we talk about radical transformation, we are talking about agricultural production systems, but we're talking about dietary patterns as well, and about waste disposal. Our demand for food and what we are demanding is driving agricultural production. And then the way we consume food and the way we dispose of food is also very important. When we look at 1/3 of global food production is basically wasted. So if we look at it visually, we're talking about agricultural production that covers the size of Russia that goes to the waste dump. So any kind of future approach must be an integrated approach. And based on the also latest IPCC report, which was launched 2 weeks ago, we really have very limited opportunity for action, because the change that is happening in the environment or in climate change is happening at a faster scale than we had considered earlier on. So we are living currently in an era where there are advances in science and technology. There is a growing recognition among policymakers of these challenges. It is not as much as we would love to, but there is a growing recognition globally. There's also rising citizen awareness and involvement, which is all positive things. But the main message, I think, that needs to be communicated more, in my opinion, moving forward by the media, by journalists, by everyone, is that we cannot separate adaptation from mitigation. And here I mention adaptation and mitigation without climate change, because it's not only the climate crisis. We do have several crises that are unfolding together. And when we talk about adaptation, about mitigation, about really reinventing our food system, we should be looking at all of those crises together in one holistic way. Thank you. And I guess we can cover more specifically about agricultural how can we do adaptation and mitigation, or what we're calling climate smart agriculture, in the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Sita, for this actually important presentation, because also I agree with you that we cannot separate the adaptation from mitigation. And unfortunately, most of the countries, they concentrate in mitigation, the greenhouses emission, but they don't actually care more about the adaptation programs. And this is why we are now saying that the NDCC plans, when they are actually need to be reviewed this year before the COP26, it's need actually to concentrate on this issue. Because this is why we are suffering from the climate change impacts. But also, one of the actually information, it is very actually important that you highlighted that 70% of fresh water, it goes to agriculture. And this is why most of the countries, like, for example, Jordan, because it's the poorest country in the water resources, we are suffering from that issue. So now here we can actually to move to our next speaker, Dr. Majd El-Naber. She's actually the team leader and senior researcher, sustainable development in the WANA Institute. She's gonna talk more about the implications of water shocks to vulnerable communities. So Ms. or Dr. Majd, the floor is yours.
Sorry, the mute thing.
No worries.
So good evening, esteemed expert, colleagues, and attendees. Thank you for this kind invitation, and thanks you for highlighting the urgent and important topic, climate change and agriculture. Actually, I want to double your idea and also see your idea between regarding that we can separate adaptation and mitigation. We need to work and balance between adaptation and mitigation, and this is the message that I always try to advocate, because normally in different conferences, not only in Jordan, we always say, okay, we need to concentrate on the adaptation activities because we are not that much contributed to the CO2 and the emissions. But I believe that this should be shifted and changed, and we start to advocate that, to implement a balance between both adaptation and mitigation. So I will share my screen. How can I do this one? Okay. Just 1 minute. Okay, and I will stop the video for the connection. So before starting, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Majd El-Naber, team leader and senior researcher for the Sustainable Development Pillar at WANA Institute. So WANA is a policy think tank. We are a nonprofit organization. We are located in Jordan, but we have a regional mandate. We are operating under the chairmanship of His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan bin Talal. WANA promotes research based on evidence for four main themes or pillars, as we call it: human security, economic growth, social justice, and sustainable development. We adopt different approach in conducting our work, but we always have a mission to decrease the gap between all users by adopting bottom-up approach. So today I will highlight the topic, the implication of water shocks on vulnerable communities. Before starting with defining water shocks, because there is a lot of scholars regarding water shocks, how it's defined, what is the water shocks, and how we can mitigate and adapt to these water shocks. So I will start by presenting facts related to water availability in WANA region. So water availability and accessibility are essential factors to achieve and sustain country development. The global water withdrawal have more than doubled since the 16th without any sign of slowing down. We are not adopting any concrete methodology in order to decrease this decrease in water availability, not only in MENA region, but also worldwide. Globally, there are 17 countries that are facing extreme high water stress. 12 out of the 17 are in the Middle East and North Africa, and 5 out of the 12 are located in the Levant or Al-Mashraq. The availability and accessibility of water resources in MENA are normally associated with population growth, accelerated demand in these water resources, food insecurity, insufficient management, and augmented by natural disaster associated with climate change. As it appears in this figure, and as also Farah mentioned, Jordan is one of the most water-stressed countries based in water stress index, and it's followed directly by Libya and then Algeria. Normally, the water stress is accelerated with the effect of climate change and also man-made activity. Since the 18th, the effect of climate change has been obvious in the region. Based on the Environment Prediction Report for MENA region, drought, earthquake, flood, and storms were observed between the 80 and 2008, and as a result, more than 37 million people were affected negatively, both socially and economically. But please, this number, the 37 million people, are only between the 80 and 2008. So by nowadays, there's a lot of increase in that number, I believe. Water become more scarce, environmental degradation become more obvious, and demographical change were quite evident through urban and rural migration. And this is one of the effects of water scarcity, water shocks, migration, urban, rural migration, and in some time, it's considered like a trigger for some tension in specific countries. Based on several scholars, it's predicted that deforestation rate will increase by 4% in the future. Annual temperature will increase between 2 to 6%, and the crop yield will be decreased between 30% and 60% based on the increase in temperature. Natural disaster normally or globally have doubled since the 18, but in MENA region specifically, it have tripled. Drought normally it occurs between 6 to 8 years, but nowadays it takes place every 1 to 2 years. And the same of for the flash flood, the number of people affected by a flash flood have doubled over the past 10 years. So due to climate change and man-made contribution, several water shocks are noticed in the region. And in this context, we define the water shocks are flash flood, salinity, drought, seawater intrusion, pollution, heat waves, wildfires, and cyclones. So maybe you will say that heat waves and wildfire, how it's connected to water shocks. It doesn't need to be directly connected to the water and water shocks, but it's gonna be like a side effect of these water shocks in a way or another. So in this slide, let me provide you with some example of water shocks. Where did it occur in the region and what its effect on the community? Let's start with Syria. Before March 2011, before the tension in Syria started, Syria has always been known for its food self-sufficiency. 2/3 of the cultivated land in Syria is rain-fed and the rest is groundwater-based agriculture. But since the beginning of 18th century, a flocculation and precipitation event has been noticed, and this was associated directly with frequent drought seasons, especially between 2006 and 2010. The USDA meteorological map data for Syria indicated that the winter season between 2007 and 2008 saw the peak of the drought, which had an average precipitation dropped by 50% from north to south in Al-Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Hasakeh, and Homs. This changing condition exacerbated the demand for existing water as rain-fed farms began to depend on groundwater. So farmers shifted and started digging hundreds of illegal wells to meet their water demand, and that directly affected the groundwater resources quality and quantity and caused an increasing the salinity of these groundwater. All of the above led to agriculture insecurity and caused massive agriculture failure and livestock mortality. And this dramatically reduced the groundwater supply and increasing Syria's vulnerability to drought. Accordingly to all these factors and sequences, 40,000 till 60,000 families were migrated from the countries that I mentioned before to Elpo and Daraa. Moreover, flash flood occurs in 2018 and 2019 in Al-Hol and Arishe camp, led to flee of over 27,000 individuals. So the effect of water shocks doesn't only occur on in areas and in communities, but also it affects the camp. For Iraq, we can also notice the situation is not much different. In Iraq, there is a flood, there is salinity, there is a drought always, and the climate change is set to intensify Iraq's weather with higher temperature. Iraq recorded one of the highest temperature of 52 Celsius in July 2020, intensive heat wave. The intense rainfall will cause a higher rate of flash flood, rise of sea level, and drought incident. So accordingly, frequent harm drought events happened between the year of 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010, 2011. The first drought episode between 2007 and 2009 was restricted to northern Iraq. Agricultural in 2009 were also strict with high salinity. Accordingly, 40% there were a reduction of 40% in the cultivated land in that area due to the drought season. And also around 8,000 families migrated due to several conditions, including the loss of crops and livestock. So some compensation were provided to farmers by the Iraqi government to overcome the drought consequences. But this is not always the case with every water shock incident, and this is not the case in all countries. This is the case for Iraq, and we can hear some of example in Jordan and also some of the Turkish government. They try to subsidize and compensate farmers who are affected by water shocks incident, but we can't generalize that, that option. In Yemen, Hadramaut and Sana'a faced several tropical storms and heavy rain between 2008 and 2010, and accordingly 20,000 individuals were migrated internally. And for floods, also it occurred in Adan, Taiz, and several coastal areas in 2015, and accordingly 70,000 and 70,800 people were migrated also internally. In Lebanon, there is another story, there is another aspect, which is wildfire. In 2006, it happened in south of Lebanon. It's burned 2,000 till 2,050 hectares of frosty grass and cropland. And the flood happened in Akkar, Baalbek, El Hermel, and Biqa governorate in 2017, where 4,100 IDPs were migrated. So, but who are the most affected? I started the presentation mentioning the vulnerable communities, but who are the vulnerable communities? From my opinion, and we can add to this list, they are small farmers, the poorest one, the one who can't pay to cope and mitigate with the climate change, the people who are less informative and less knowledgeable, if we can call them like that, the small household, and the people who are living by the sea or near the sea, near the rangeland and forests, and the people who are living in the downstream, because they will be more affected by the flash flood. How we can adapt and mitigate to these water shocks? I believe increasing country resilience toward the climate change through developing technologies and tools to predict the effect of climate change, increase the preparedness level and adaptive capacity through disaster management and risk reduction. This is from the governmental part of view. We can also increase the individual resilience toward climate change by providing required knowledge and capacity building to all users about the climate change effect, how they can cope with it, the science behind the climate change. We can provide the users with to know how, so they can use the technology that will be introduced to them when it's developed. Subsidies and compensation to the affected user to decrease potential economic and social tension. And thank you for your listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Majd, for your presentation and for highlighting the stress water in most of the countries, especially in the MENA region. And now it's most of the impact of the climate change. It's now you can see it in most of the countries actually in the whole world. And this is what we heard from our presenters today. And they highlighted in the most actually impacts in different countries. So if there's, now we're gonna actually open the floor for any question from the audience, if there's any question to our presenters. So please feel free to ask your questions actually. Okay. So, okay, I think we don't have any questions from the audience, but maybe I can ask one question for all of you, actually. You actually mentioned and highlighted the solution for dealing with climate change and agriculture issue, but let's say more what's it's needed now before the COP26. What do you think we need from the governments itself so we can actually address and adopt more, let's say, in programs that it's actually really helps the farmers in most of the regions. So please go ahead. Dr. Majd, we can start with you because you are.
Actually, I will keep it very short. I believe we need well-defined priorities. We need to define the roadmap, what do we want to achieve, and how we can engage the end user, the local community in that process, to listen from them what activities regarding mitigation and adaptation they would like to implement based on the urgent environmental need based on their community, not only based on from the umbrella policymaker. But before doing that, I believe that we need to have a well-defined priorities and how we can decrease the effect of climate change in a collective way.
Okay, Sita.
Yes, thank you, Majd. So to add on what Majd said, in addition to well-defined roadmap and priorities, I believe that there should be a wide-scale appreciation and understanding at all levels within the countries of the extent of the emergency and the extent of the measures that are needed. Because some of those measures, if we throw everything on the government's shoulders, there are policy decisions that would have to be taken for the transformation that would be hurtful to us as citizens or to companies if we want to stay with our current way of life or our current consumption patterns, our current production patterns. So there is really more of a need and an appreciation at all levels that everyone has to take and do their role in that. As citizens, we have the role to change our consumption, because by changing our habits, we are sending a clear message to the government that we are willing to change. We're sending a clear message to the industry that they need to change if they want to sell us their products. The businesses have to change the way they produce. So I think we can't throw the extent of the transformation needed, it cannot be shouldered by one entity by itself. That's my opinion.
I totally agree. Before we go to Jess, there's a question from Jane. We know that climate change has become political. How political will water and wildfires become in the future? And how will this affect agriculture? What does the panel actually think? I think this is maybe for Jess and as well Dr. Majd, but let's start from Jess. We can't hear you. You are muted. Thank you.
Sorry, that was a bit silly. Yeah, I think I'll leave the water one, but I think, yeah, I definitely think wildfires will become more political because, again, it's about changing our understanding of what's happening. I think we have this real approach that is very like, oh, let's fix it, let's just fix it kind of thing, and it becomes like very one-dimensional, a kind of one-dimensional approach to dealing with it. And at the moment, that is very much happening in terms of governments, I think, are throwing resources at battling wildfires when they actually happen. But from what I can tell, like putting very little thought into how to stop them happening in the first place, or how to at least kind of slow them down and make sure they don't become so big. But it's all kind of, to me, also it feels symptomatic of how humans tend to think, which is the whole reason why we're in this mess with climate change, and it's not being able to see like a kind of longer term solution really. And I think a lot of people, when obviously wildfires feel so extreme, especially when people are having to run for their lives, that I think governments feel very pressured to deal with something very quickly, but actually it's not a quick fix. It's about landscape scale change. It's about like adaptation to climate change as well. It's about making more sustainable farming economically viable, educating consumers so that, and giving the tools to consumers so that they have the ability to choose food that is truly sustainable. So it's a whole range of things, but it's definitely going to become more political, I think, yes.
Yeah, Dr. Majd, you can answer the question before we go to Shaheen from Bangladesh.
Okay, I will keep it short. Actually, there is a lot of people or scholars who are blaming water scarcity to climate change. But I believe that the equation is more complicated than this. Water scarcity is increasing due to several factors, not only climate change. Climate change is increasing that effect, yeah, for sure, but there is a population, there is the refugees, there is the dams that are built in several countries that prevent the recharge of several aquifers, especially the downstream aquifers. Yes, you are right. I believe that some, until a certain extent, water scarcity and the link between the climate change are trying to make it more political in order to conserve more water for some country comparing to the other country. The solution for that, I believe that we need to implement transboundary water management in a collective way, and a collective approach that all countries will respect the agreement and the laws, and stop linking directly the climate change with water scarcity, because it's not only the main factor that affects the water availability, especially in our region.
Can I just,
Thank
sorry,
you,
can I just
yeah.
jump in again? I just noticed
Okay.
Jane's little message. She just says fire and water don't know about country borders, and I think that's really important. Yes, I think both like big wildfires and water scarcity and stuff they're obviously already creating migration like internally, but it will become like more across borders, and we're already seeing that. And of course, like I was saying earlier, with something like with wildfires, the impact of them, because they're coming so big and extreme, like the impact of them is being felt well beyond where they're actually located as well. So in terms of, like we said, like actually changing the weather somewhere that might be literally 1,000 kilometers away, changing the air quality somewhere else, you know, all these things like that, they are just going to become, yes, we just have to stop thinking of ourselves being like just on our own, like, oh, well, I'm all right. And I was like, well, no, you're not. So yes, they're going to become much more globally political, I think, and regionally too.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Please, Shaheen, go ahead and ask your question directly to the panelists. We can't hear you. Shaheen? No? I think there's a problem with your mic, actually, Shaheen. If you want to type your question, or maybe it's going to be faster. I think he's kind of dealing with the.
Maybe he can type the question in the chat.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay, there's there's a question for Mirjana. She's saying, what gives the three panelists hope? Hope. Maybe she's trying to say, is there's any hope? I don't know.
So I can
please.
So I think we're living in an era where we have unprecedented crises emerging, but we're also living in an era where we have never been as connected together as we are now. Advances in science and technology have never been this fast and expected to accelerate. And our understanding as well has increased tremendously. What gives me hope is looking at the grassroots movements that have started growing over the globe during the past 2 years. COVID halted them a little bit, but that's the seed that can grow, from my perspective.
Yeah. Any thoughts from Jess or Dr. Majd? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
No, I was just going to pick up on what Steve
Can you
said.
hear me? Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you, Shaheen. Go ahead, please, before
Sorry.
other questions.
Sorry for internet disconnecting. I have a question, one question, and thanks for giving me opportunity. Earlier presentation, we know 30% of world agricultural land are risk of pesticide pollution, and 31% are high risk. I just mentioned one thing, as a South Asian countries of Bangladesh, here is, I think, pollution is more than world average. Just one information I can share you, more than 90% of agricultural land has shortage of nitrogen. So Bangladesh is a country of pesticides pollution and pesticide use and pesticide expansion. On the other hand, we see lots of production are going on in Bangladesh. So what is the dilemma and what is the role, what should be the policymaker and journalist role to prevent pesticides expansion, pesticides regulation? As we know, private companies are pursuing farmers, fully pursuing farmers in South Asian country to use pesticides to give land getting more crop. They are pursuing farmers. So what should be the role for policymaker and journalists to prevent this kind of activities? Thank you.
I think maybe this question more to Jess, because it's about journalists and the political also. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess from the journalist perspective, I guess it's about using your skills and networks and everything as a journalist to give as much advice as you possibly can, give the farmers as many tools as you possibly can through like advice pieces and you know, like a real interrogation of the current method of farming that uses that amount of pesticides, and kind of helping to give the farmers the real tools that they can then like develop a different kind of farming system. But I mean, I don't know whether it's viable as well to be able to produce things that really like help farmers to question their use of pesticides and the intentions of these companies and possibly you know, people associated with them or not. But I think, yeah, journalism definitely has an important role to play, a bit more like as a kind of information advice sort of system, I think, and knowledge sharing as well between farmers who are moving away from that and leading the way and showing other farmers like what can be done alternatively.
Yes, Sita.
Yeah, so I'll add to that is that currently what's driving high pesticide use is the monoculture that is going on. The monoculture is driven by our food demand. Currently, 62% of what we consume as humans is 3 crops. And 15 crops comprise around more than 90% of our consumption. So that basically then mirrors on what farmers grow. So you have these vast areas of monocultures that are susceptible to pest infestations, which require farmers to use pesticide. So I guess it's the question of what comes first, the egg or the chicken, because you really cannot tell farmers don't use pesticides. And then on the other side, your demand is requiring wheat, rice, and maize, and that's what they're growing, which makes their field susceptible to insects. And as journalists, I think these figures, I'm not sure how much from the population realizes that they're actually more than 60% of what they consume is 3 crops. And if we look at the variety of crops, there are around 30,000 edible crops, of which 7,000 have been used by us humans throughout history. But currently, if we go across the globe, we're growing only 150 crops.
Thank you, Sita. There's a question, actually, there's 3 questions, so maybe we can answer fast because we are actually running out of time. So there's the Bustini, there's a question. The IPCC has given its clearest warning about the climate change risk, comforting the word. If we continue to walk the slow lane of negation, food security is at the heart of the impending climate Armageddon. How do we get the political will for action now? I think, Sita, you can answer this question, and maybe as well other panelists. Go ahead.
I think in part we've answered some of it, which is it's difficult really to put our fingers around it. It's very big, but it is. I'm of the school that says you can't put everything on the government's shoulder. It has to be a collective decision and a collective action by everyone. So how open are we to changing our food consumption? How open are we to changing our habits of what we wear, what houses we live in? It's all connected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Majd, there's something you need to add?
Actually, yes. I wanted to highlight the importance of the involvement of grassroots, community-based organizations, local communities in trying to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and also several environmental challenges and needs. But before involving them, we need to provide them with adequate knowledge, adequate capacity building, try to increase the terminology of environmental ownership, in all countries, so they can be a part of equation and they can sense that the business as usual, we can't continue like this now. We need to change the business as usual, trying to adapt a new technology, new tools, and try to use this in order to decrease our consumption and make it more sustainable. Thank you.
Jess, do you need to add anything from your side?
Not really. I mean, I was just kind of go back to an earlier question about what gives me hope, and I think it sort of links to this one a little bit, which is that I think the younger generation, the people sort of in their teens and 20s, give me hope. Like, they're so engaged with these issues and they really want to fight for it, and I think they really want to make the right choices and things like that. So I think, again, if it comes back a little bit to what Sita was saying, it's not all about what government can do, and it's definitely not letting them off the hook because we can't do it without them, but it's about giving like citizens the tools and the information to be able to make the right choices as well. And in doing so, we start to then factor in the true costs of food production, because at the moment, like, the real costs of food production are not factored into the prices. So that then starts a whole set of things when that is factored in, I think.
Yeah. So there is also a question from Olivia. How do you think we can get to global action when there is such a big divide between rich and poor countries? Who wants to answer this question?
Oh, it's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah, I know it's a big one, actually. Sita, Dr. Majd, you have an idea?
So I think the divide is indisputable, that there is a divide, but it also allows developing countries the opportunity to leapfrog to modern technologies, while the developed countries are actually, many of them are locked into infrastructure that is already high polluting. So there would be costs and benefits.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't have much to add on that, more than that at the moment. It's a deep question. We really need to think of it much more.
Yeah, actually, Farah, I think that we need, first of all, to define what does it mean rich country and poor country, and which terminology, because, for example, in Jordan, yes, we are developing countries, and we also have a good connection with a rich country, if I call them the EU, the USA, and they can support us by financial capacity, and we can implement several projects that increase our resilience in a way or another, even if it's climate change or human security or different subjects. So we need to define who are the poor country, who are the rich country, how we can decrease the gap between these two categories of country by several cooperation, if I want to be optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
No, I would just add, I think it's I don't know how we achieve it, but I think it's a mindset change as well, an understanding that we are completely interconnected, and it's just not feasible to kind of assume that what we do in one place doesn't affect other people anymore. Like it's so, it's so interconnected, and I think the COVID crisis and the vaccination rollout is a perfect example of a kind of lack of understanding about our sort of interdependence across boundaries, whether we're rich or poor or whatever we want to call it. It's not possible to just pretend that we're okay wherever we are and we're not going to be affected and we're not going to affect other people. So it's a mindset change, and I think it's about, like, in terms of food and farming, it's about understanding that that ecologically we have a kind of farm ecosystem, which then moves to a regional one, which moves to like a continental one, which is then eventually like the globe. We have like an earth kind of ecosystem that we have to look after, and it's a shared thing. So
exactly. Yeah, we have a last question from Prospenda. It's actually, I think it's a French, but there's an English version. As the issue of lake and water management has no borders. In the DRC, this issue must be of the paramount importance given its wealth of water and forests. Today, we would like to have knowledge to develop agroecology through AGSC and the farmers organization. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I believe it's a comment more than question, no?
Yeah, but from water perspective, what do you think, Dr. Majd?
Yeah, for sure, I agree 100%. We can't work in silos. We need the engagement of all users, regardless if even they are individual or based on as an organization.
Yeah, totally agree. So we are actually running out of the scheduled time for the session. But I would like to thank our presenters and our audience as well, and for the interactive between the audience and the presenter as well, the questions. It was really a very actually important session, because now most of the countries, they are affected by climate change, and we, if you turn on the TV, you will see a lot of news coming from different countries talking about the impact of climate change. And this is why we are saying as a journalist as well, that this is the time that it's need the governments to deal with the impact of the climate change, even through the mitigation plans and the adaptation plans as well. And because we are now, there's no time left before the COP26. So I think the countries need to raise up their ambitions and to come with really a new indices plans that it's giving hope to the countries that they're gonna reduce the number of actually gas greenhouses, and maybe the rich countries that they dependent on oil in their actually economy, they can actually take a real action plan and help the development country to build programs that really help them to adapt to the climate change impact, and even the farmers as well, because they are maybe the vulnerable actually people who are suffering from that. And don't forget that in Tunisia, after we saw the wildfire, we saw one of the farmers in the TV. He was crying because his farm was actually harm from the wildfire around Tunisia, and it was really a very bad situation there. So yeah, so we hope so that the government will really take a real and a fast action in the coming period. Thank you very much again, and thank you for our audience. I think Hugh, now we're gonna have a break. If that's right, this is what it's mentioned on the program. And yeah,
yes.
Thank you very much. Hugh,
yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Farah, for moderating. That was a great discussion, and thank you to our presenters for taking the time.